Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on Lesson 17 of Paul's Epistle to the Romans, and we're covering Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25. This one's called All Creation Groans for Redemption. Once again, we begin this wonderful chapter of Romans 8 with no condemnation, and we finish it with no separation. Picture us all as passengers on the Titanic without any lifeboats. In that situation, everyone would die. But with Jesus as our Savior, He is the lifeboat for each of us, and there's nothing that can separate us from God. One thing that tries to separate us from God is the flesh, as this earthly life as Christians consists of a battle between the spirit and the flesh. The minds of Christians should be set on what the Spirit desires. And though none of us has attained this as our standard all the time, we should want to. We can oversimplify the relationship between a Christian and sin. Yes, we are no longer slaves to sin, but the attraction of sin still can be very strong. Paul spoke of a thorn in the flesh, and we don't know if that thorn was a physical issue or a sin that Paul continued to struggle with. A dear friend of mine once told me that he thinks Paul did not identify that thorn in the flesh, so all of us could attribute our own struggle with the same struggle that Paul endured. This describes our walks with Jesus. Notice that walking is not the same as running, flying, or motoring. God desires for us to walk with Him just as Adam walked with Him in the Garden of Eden. Walking is slow progression, not always in a single direction, but no matter what, God will complete His work in us. Let's read today's passage. Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25 says this: "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of Him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. Not only that, but we also, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. For we were saved in this hope. But hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with perseverance." Most of us have the tendency of complaining in the most mundane circumstances. Our complaints are typically addressed to inconveniences. Do we even know, experientially, what suffering is? Paul certainly knew the meaning of suffering, as did Jesus. The Jews in concentration camps during World War II certainly suffered as well. Our first step in understanding this passage is to identify our personal association with suffering. Suffering can be physical, emotional, mental, or certainly a combination of all three. I remember reading a book in college called The Body in Pain, not so ironically written by a woman named Elaine Scarry. The biggest premise of the book was that to someone who never has experienced pain, a pinprick would seem deadly. But once we've experienced pain, our response changes with our expectations. Before understanding Paul's words, we should start with Paul's history, his experience. Let's begin by reflecting on the sufferings of Paul. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 22 through 29 says this: "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily? My deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? Paul was whipped by the Jews 5 times, each with 39 lashes. Deuteronomy 25:3 states that 40 lashes was allowable, but the Jews changed that to 39 lashes to ensure that they never went past 40. Many years later, I still can remember my mom beating me with a switch, a young tree branch. The thinner the branch, the more pain it caused, as it cut through the air faster and built up speed before making contact with my flesh. I also remember the pain of the welts that lasted for days while trying to sit in school. It wasn't anything like 39 lashes, though. Paul's willingness to endure this kind of abuse tells us much about his commitment to the gospel. And at the same time, it also reveals how much the Jews despised Jesus. In this passage from 2 Corinthians, Paul said that he had been shipwrecked 3 times. But he wrote this letter many years before Acts was written, and Acts 27 included a description of a 4th shipwreck. There was a worker on board the Titanic who was known for surviving 4 shipwrecks. We would attribute that to bad luck, but we know that there is no such thing as luck, no such thing as karma, and there are no coincidences with God. Also, Paul was stoned at Lystra and dragged outside the town as they thought he was dead. He might have been dead, but if he was, God raised him from the dead. We cannot know if Paul actually was dead that day, but we do know the severity of the stoning based on the assumption by those stoning him that he was dead. What did Paul do when he regained consciousness? He went back into Lystra to preach some more. Wow! That reveals that Paul's understanding of earthly suffering was much different from ours. I would guess that if we could have a conversation with Paul right now and ask him what the most difficult thing was that he endured, Paul would not mention any of these things on his resume of suffering. Instead, I would guess that the greatest suffering in the life of Paul involved looking back on the persecution he had performed on the early church and upon the followers of Jesus, including Stephen. Jesus certainly had forgiven Paul, but Paul carried that with such shame and sadness that he might not ever have forgiven himself. But because of what Paul had done in his past, he understood the gift of the gospel of Jesus Christ more than most. That is reminiscent of a parable shared by Jesus to a Pharisee named Simon. Luke chapter 7, verses 40 through 47 says this, "And Jesus answered and said to him, 'Simon, I have something to say to you.' So he said, 'Teacher, say it.' There was a certain creditor who had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him more?' Simon answered and said, 'I suppose the one whom he forgave more.' And he said to him, 'You have rightly judged.' Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, 'Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Paul loved Jesus much because of the many sins that Jesus had forgiven in Paul's life. Through this lens, Paul compared any suffering that he had been called to endure for Christ and for the gospel, and compared that to the glory to come. When we get to heaven, there will not be one person who will look back on the difficulties of the world and think it was not worth everything to simply enter the gates of heaven. And that is just entry to heaven, not the other blessings that come after entering. I often have wondered why some people seem to suffer much more than others. But then I am reminded that we are to keep our eyes on Jesus rather than comparing our lives to others. Most of us look at suffering with dread. But when God allows suffering in our lives, we should take it as a compliment. First of all, by allowing us to be in great difficulties, Jesus is telling us that we are strong. God would not allow these difficulties in our lives unless he's trying to bring us closer to him. For any who have read Fox's Book of Martyrs, we can see that those whom God called to suffer for him were not facing the difficulties alone. God holds us close to him through those events. I'm reminded of Corrie ten Boom, a Christian who endured the Ravensbrück concentration camp, who said, "There is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still." What causes suffering? Well, it did not exist until sin entered the picture. We have the tendency of blaming God for our difficulties, rather than realizing that most of the time we should just take ownership. Our faulty logic is that God has the power to end the difficulties in our lives, and when those difficulties continue, we might feel like he has let us down. We need to remember that our eyes have the most limited vision in comparison to God, who knows everything and sees past, present, and future. He also sees exactly how seemingly unrelated things can change based on a single event or decision, like ripples in a calm lake. But when sin entered the picture, all creation changed. God created Adam as perfect and eternal, and when Adam made the decision to rebel against God and become imperfect, Adam also lost the eternal and became mortal. Adam passed that sin curse down to each of us. We also know how this sin affected Adam and Eve directly. They were sent out of the garden, and through God, their curse was passed down to every man and every woman. Genesis 3, verses 16 through 19 says this, "To the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it, all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. And you shall eat the herb of the field, and the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." But Adam's sin did not just affect mankind. It changed all of creation. We have great difficulty looking at the beauty of the earth and not considering how much more beautiful the Garden of Eden would have been than the most beautiful place on earth today. I would guess that before sin, there were no storms, no calamities like earthquakes, tsunamis, tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, blizzards, or famines. There probably were not poisonous animals and poisonous insects, or animals that killed people, I also would guess there weren't mosquitoes that sucked our blood and made us itch. There weren't flies that buzzed us all the time, or bees, wasps, and hornets to sting us. The sun was likely never so hot that it burned people. Weather never was so cold that people froze to death. Everything changed when sin entered the picture. But the other way of looking at this is that everything will change when sin exits the picture. I always have wondered if animals were able to talk before sin. Remember, when the serpent spoke to Eve, she didn't go back to Adam and tell him that the most amazing thing happened. A serpent spoke to me today. Instead, she just took it as commonplace and then encouraged Adam to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in defiance to God. If she was not surprised by the talking snake, maybe it was so common for animals to speak. If that is the case, that might also occur in eternity. Paul reminded us that all creation groans for the redemption to come. Maybe the earth is groaning when we have earthquakes. I know that my old knees and old body are groaning to be able to run and jump again without pain. In this passage, Paul also reminded us that our bodies also long to be redeemed. When we die, our spirit and soul go to heaven. Ecclesiastes 12:7 says, "And the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." Luke 12:20 said this, "But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided?' But the body remains in the ground and is corrupted quickly. But there will be a time when God will resurrect our corrupted bodies, just as he resurrected the uncorrupted body of Jesus. When Jesus returns in the air for his church, 1 Thessalonians 4 tells us the dead in Christ will rise first. Those are not just spirits and souls going to heaven, but resurrected bodies. This passage ends by reminding us that we were saved in this hope, and that a hope that has been fulfilled is no longer a hope. For those who hope to go to Israel, once we've taken that trip, we can keep those memories alive, as the hope of visiting there will have been accomplished. In that way, faith and hope will someday be accomplished, and will someday pass away. But love never will pass away. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.